Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers. So today, final day for main set spoilers. We just got the full set a little while ago. You can check it all out over at MTGpreviews.com, sort it, filter it, all that good stuff. But we still got a ton of cards to talk about. Seriously, so many crazy things, which means we should probably jump right into it. Although before we do, a couple of quick things. Number one, if you need some Kamigawa cards, or any cards for that matter, you can get them from our awesome sponsor, Card Kingdom, by heading to cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish and even get a free MTG Goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes and they'll hook you up. Number two, even though we've reached the end of main set spoilers, there's still a ton of Kamigawa to come. We got Commander Precon spoilers on Monday, and then after that, we're going to have top 10 videos talking about the best cards in the set for various formats. We'll have gameplay on the YouTube, on the stream, so look forward to all of that over the next couple weeks as well. But anyway, let's talk one more time about the main set of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. So first up today, we got one more Mythic Saga in Jugen Defends the Temple. So Jugen Defends the Temple, 3 mana, lore counter 1, make a 1/1 green human monk creature that can tap to add a green mana. Lore counter number 2, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Lore counter number 3, exile it, return it into a 2/2 flyer that says, when another creature enters a battlefield under your control, you can pay X mana. When you do, put X +1/+1 counters on that creature, and then, as long as you have 5 or more modified creatures, Remnant of the Rising Star gets +5/+5 in trample, so it turns into a 7/7 flying trampler. This card is interesting. The backside does seem pretty powerful. At the same time, it's a little slow still. If you think through how this works, essentially you play this on turn 3, and you get a Llanowar Elf. Sure, it's got a different creature type and it's a token, but still, it's a turn 3 Llanowar Elves. Turn 4, you get a Gird for Battle, where you're putting a counter on 2 things. That's 2 1-mana spells that are happening pretty slowly, and then turn 5, you're going to flip this around. Turn 6, you can actually start attacking with it. The backside, though, is a pretty powerful creature. I think it is only a 2/2 to start, but essentially is a Windrake that gives all of your creatures Wildborn Preserver's ability. Wildborn Preserver, when a creature comes into play, you can pay X and put X counters on Wildborn Preserver. Once you have Remnant of the Rising Star out, any creature that you play, you can just dump all your mana into it and make it big, and then if you can get those 5 modified creatures, which with the help of the second lore counter on the front half, putting a couple counters on thing, with Remnant of the Rising Star's ability to add counters to the things that you play, doesn't seem that difficult. Then you essentially get a Palladium Morse or a Lord of the Pit, a massive 7/7 flying trampler. So is this card going to be good enough to see play in Standard? I don't know. It feels like a limited bomb. Like, in limited, this card seems absolutely insane. In Standard, it's kind of what we've been talking about with modified all spoiler season. If this card has a chance, I think it's going to be in some sort of +1/+1 counter theme deck. Honestly, I think as far as 60 card play is concerned, modified is essentially going to mean has a counter on it. Like, sure, I'm sure there'll be some fun, funky, janky brews where you're doing it with auras or equipment, but as far as like actually trying to be competitive, I think it's mostly going to mean +1/+1 counters. We do have the pieces to make this work, like Swarm Shambler, Luminarch Aspirant, into Jugen and Ornery Foos and Felidar Retreat. So there are pieces to make a +1/+1 counter deck work. Is Jugen Defends the Temple going to be good enough for it? The slowness still just scares me. Like, it seems powerful once you flip it. Is flipping on turn 5 going to be too slow for it to see play? I guess we're going to have to wait and see. I do think this is one of the more powerful of the sagas that we've seen from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. I think the sagas from the set are mostly designed for limited. I would rank this a top tier as far as sagas, but I think even being a top tier saga from this set still means competitive play is going to be questionable. Also works pretty well with some other stuff. Halana and Elena, for example, works well with the counter theme. Torrens can put counters on a bunch of stuff with its training ability, so there are potential homes for this card. And then once you get back to Commander, then it becomes pretty interesting there as well in some sort of +1/+1 counter theme deck. Hamza, maybe a Troxa. It works well with Vorinclex adding more counters. Works well, really well with Doubling Season. You double up your monk tokens, you double up your +1/+1 counters, and then you double up your backside counters as well. So there are some shenanigans here. So I don't want to make it sound like Jugen Defends the Temple is just a stone unplayable card, because I don't think that's true. Although, as far as 60 card competitive play, I'm still skeptical of just pretty much all these sagas, and even though I think that Yugen Defense of Temple is one of the most powerful ones that we've seen, I'm still not sure it's going to be quite good enough. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm really rooting for these sagas because sagas are one of the coolest card types. These new designs that flip into creatures are really, really spicy. And I'm hoping that maybe once we get to start playing with them, they're going to play a lot more powerful and a little bit faster than they look. But for now, I'm in wait and see mode. We also got our last channel land, Aganjo Seat of the Empire. So our white channel land, like the other ones, come into play untapped. You can channel it for 3 mana or less if you have some legends, and it deals 4 damage to target attacking and blocking creature. This card, I think, is going to be really, really powerful. It's essentially Divine Arrow or Gideon's Reproach. Not great removal spells, but not horrible removal spells. But it comes attached to a land, which, again, with all these cards, is the biggest deal. Like a Mythic MDFC that's a cheap removal spell, which is really, really powerful. As far as Standard is concerned, I actually think this card is kind of great. In Standard, this kills essentially everything that you want to kill. It can snipe Goldspan Dragon without giving your opponent a treasure because it's not becoming targeted by a spell. It's just an ability. It doesn't care about taxes of things like Redain or Thalia. Like, because this is an ability rather than a spell, there's certainly upside there. And then if you look at the most played creatures in Standard, I actually went through the 25 most played. The only one that this does not kill is Hullbreaker Horror. Out of the top 25, so this kills essentially everything you could want to kill. Sure, there's a timing restriction, you gotta be attacking or blocking, whatever, but that's attached to a land. It's a land that kills basically everything in Standard. Plus, now that Faceless Haven is banned, this card has an easy home. With Faceless Haven in the format, there was some weird pressure on your mana base in a deck like Mono White because you need a bunch of snow-covered lands to turn on Faceless Haven. Now that Faceless Haven is gone, there's not really any reason that you gotta play snow-covered lands, and you can play more non-basic lands. So I think that Aganjo is just a straight up 4 of in decks like Mono White in Standard. So I think that Aganjo is straight up 4 of in a deck like Mono White in Standard. Once you get back to older formats, it becomes a little bit more questionable. I still think, because it's a land that comes into play untapped, it's still a really powerful effect, and I think it will show up in decks going back to Modern, maybe Legacy, definitely in Commander as well, but it's going to be a little bit more hit or miss matchup-wise, because sometimes you're going to run into a Teferi control deck that doesn't really have creatures. You're going to run into a combo deck like Ad Nauseam or Scapeshift that just doesn't really have creatures that are attacking or blocking, and then Aganjo is basically just a legendary plains, which isn't super good. So I rank it behind some of the other lands in older formats. I would say my current ranking of these lands for non-standard formats is Boseiju tier SS. Like, that card is just insane. Adwara, I think, is just behind Boseiju, like a solid S tier. And then the rest of them, Ajano might actually be 3rd in the ranking, but the rest of them are kind of a tier down. I'd still put them at like A's or high B's. I still think they're going to show up in multiple decks. Like, the power of being an untapped land that makes colored mana is just, it's really high if you're getting any spell effect out of it. But I do think this ranks kind of in the middle to lower tier for older formats. On the other hand, in Standard, I think this might literally be the best of the cycle. Like, in Standard, Boseiju's fine, but giving your opponents a land's pretty painful. Atwara is actually really good, but it's a little more expensive. When you think about the Standard meta, the decks that this can go in, having pre-built homes in various white and mono white and 2-color white decks, and the fact that it kills essentially everything, I think this card is going to be maybe the single best of the entire cycle for Standard play. So Aganjo card is really good. They're all really good. This cycle is going to change the way that formats are played, I think, and Aganjo is going to be part of that, even if it does rank behind some of the other ones, especially in older formats. Next on our list, we got the last of the Invoke cycle. Our green Invoke, Invoke the Ancients, and oh, it's a good one. I think Wizards trying to make up for really hosing green with the March cycle and just giving it the worst, like, laughably bad March. But its green Invoke is so good. 5 mana sorcery, make 2 4/5 green spirit creature tokens for each of them. Put your choice of a vigilance counter, a reach counter, or a trample counter on it. This card's absurd for 5 mana. It puts so much power and toughness and abilities on the battlefield. Compare it to Ebony Rhino. If you wanted to get the same amount of stats out of Ebony Rhino, it would cost 14 mana. This is power creep in action. Although, seriously, it's kind of like 2 Leatherback Balos or 2 Siege Rhinos, which is still kind of absurd. Like, you're just putting so many big bodies on the battlefield, and being able to choose what counters you put on them is really, really powerful. If you're trying to close out the game through blockers, you go with Trample. If you need to play some offense defense, you can go Vigilance. If you need to maybe block a Goldspan Dragon, let's say, you can go with a reach counter. I think the reach counter is actually really, really important with so many good flyers in Standard right now. This just shuts them down. 2 bodies in 1 card. Both of those bodies are really, really good. Invoke the Agents. I think this card has potential to be very, very strong in Standard. If you think about its competition, the green 5-drops, Froghemoth, it's a single 4/4. Ren and 7, really strong, but still, it's making 1 big token. Kuru can replace itself, but Invoke the Agents just dumps a ton of stats on the battlefield right away, so I think this card definitely has potential to see a lot of play in Standard. The only thing that worries me a little bit is the tokens are a bit soft to some removal. Fading Hope, Hidetsugu Consumes All can just kind of sweep them away, although Fading Hope has gotten less played since the Elrond's Epiphany banning, so that is a small concern, but really, it makes 2 bodies. So even if you get hit by a Fading Hope, it's not really the end of the world. So I think Invoke the Agents has a ton of potential. And then once you get back to older formats, you get even more shenanigans. Imagine like doubling season in some sort of tokeny commander deck. Not only do you get to double up the number of tokens you make, you get to double up the ability counters, which I guess doesn't really do anything. Why would 2 trample counters matter? But it's still kind of cute. Plus you got Anointed Procession and Primal Vigor. So I think Invoke the Agents is maybe the best. Actually, I'm going to go with clearly the best of the Invoke cycle as far as 60 card formats. If I was going to rank the Invoke cycle specifically for Standard play, green is number 1, and it's not even really close, followed by blue, which I do think we'll see play, at least out of the sideboard. Then we have kind of the group where they can be powerful in the right deck, but I'm not sure the deck exists. Invoke Calamity, Invoke Justice, and then Invoke Despair, way, way, way at the bottom. In the unplayable and basically every scenario tier, I do think it changes a little bit in older formats. Invoke Calamity, for example, goes up a lot in value, I think, in like Modern compared to the rest of the cycle. But for Standard in specific, Invoke the Ancients, it's just a lot of big bodies on the battlefield for a low cost and a bit of flexibility too with those ability counters. We also got Kami of Transients, a 2-mana 2/2 spirit with Trample. This says when you cast an enchantment spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then at the beginning of your end step, if an enchantment was put in the graveyard from the battlefield this turn, you may return Kami of Transients from your graveyard to your hand. You may return Kami of Transients from the graveyard to your hand. So recursive and relatively big. I think this card could be very good in an enchantment deck. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's don't underestimate recursive threats, although it is worth pointing out, unlike Bloodghast or Arclight Phoenix, Kami of Transients is coming back to your hand, so you are going to have to spend mana to recast it, so I don't think it's in the same category as like an Arclight or a Bloodghast, but still a on-curve threat that can come back into play later in the game for a relatively inexpensive cost is really, really powerful, giving a way to rebuild through removal or whatever, sweepers. So I think that even though it's not the strongest recursion ability because you got to cast it again, it's still a very, very nice ability. And then this thing just gets huge. It reminds me a little bit of Setessan Champion. Setessan Champion, of course, is also an enchantress, so it draws you cards, which Kami of Transients is not going to do. But if you've ever seen Setessan Champion in an enchantment deck, part of what makes it so scary is it just ends up massive. It's like 7 power, 9 power. Kami of Transients does the same thing. You play this on turn 2, and you sling your enchantments and your sagas, and this is just going to end up a massive threat, and it even has Trample. One of the downsides of the Setessan Champion is it gets chump blocked for days. Kami of Transients, no worries there. So I think this could be a really, really strong option for some sort of standard Enchantress style deck. Maybe even like Historic Enchantress. I don't think it's going to make it in Modern because it's not an enchantment itself. If this was an enchantment itself, it would be bonkers. But not being an enchantment is a drawback because it's not triggering your Enchantress stuff. The one criticism I have of this card is it does work a little wonkily with our new sagas. It's great with old sagas. Old sagas absolutely insane because they put themselves in the graveyard, but the new sagas don't actually go to the graveyard, so it kind of synergizes worse with Jugen Defends the Temple or the Kamigawa or whatever than you would think, because these sagas aren't going to go to the graveyard and trigger it to put it back in your hand. But on the other hand, I mean, we got traditional sagas that go to the graveyard, like this with Binding of the Old Gods. It's great. Binding of the Old Gods, already a good card. It grows it when you play it, and then later, if your Kamigawa Transients dies, or if you can mill it over, you can get it back and start it over. We got enchantment creatures that also work well with it. As far as older formats, I think that this just misses in like historic Enchantress. If you look at the creatures that see play in historic, modern Enchantress, there's basically 3 of them. Sethis as your Enchantress, Sanctum Weaver is your ramp, and then Destiny Spinner is your finisher. The thing about these cards is they are all enchantment creatures, which is a really, really big deal because they all support each other. I could see Kamigawa Transients being really, really powerful in something like Historic Enchantress, but I just don't know what it can beat out. I think it's a worse finisher than Destiny Spinner. It's not going to draw you cards like Sethis. It's not going to ramp you like Sanctum Weaver. So even though it has some value, and I do like its ability to come back from the graveyard and help you rebuild, I think that this is probably a near miss for Enchantress in older formats, but for standard Enchantress decks, Kamigawa Transients seems pretty awesome. We also got our blue March, our last March of Swirling Mist. So 1 blue and X instant can make it cheaper by exiling blue cards from your hand in up to X target creatures phase out. So March of Swirling Mist, how good is this card? I'm not 100% sure. So there is some flexibility here, similar to like Spectral Adversary, because you can use the phase out ability as like a fog or a sleep almost on your opponent's creatures. If you're afraid of dying, just phase out all your opponent's stuff. You can even do it at instant speed. And on the other hand, you can also use it like a Guardian of Faith to save your own creatures. Your opponent goes to Wrath, and you're able to blink all your own creatures, phase them out so they don't get killed, and then they'll come back and phase back in, and you can start attacking with them again. So there is some flexibility here. At the same time, the card isn't super duper efficient, and I think it's going to need a pretty specific deck. If you think about what this card does, I think like a control deck probably would just rather have a Wrath. Rather than like phasing out your opponent's creatures, you'd rather just kill them because they're only going away for a turn. So I think you're going to need a deck that wants this effect, but also can potentially use it to save your own creatures. Some sort of maybe blue-white tempo style deck. I could see this being really good in. Then, if you're up against control, this saves your board from a Doomscar or something. But if you're up against a creature deck, you can phase out your opponent's blockers to get in a big attack and just close out the game. So I really like the flexibility, but I think this is a card that's more good in specific decks than a card that I would just play in any deck. So definitely not a bad card, but a card that you need to be in a pretty specific archetype, I think, to really make it work. We also got, oh my goodness, a card that might be one of the most powerful in the entire set. Makoti Soulripper. This vehicle is absurd. 2 mana, 4/3. When it attacks, you can sacrifice an artifact or a creature. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains menace until end of turn, and it crews for 2. This card is so incredibly above the curve that I think this card has potential to be a staple in various formats. If you think about what this is, first off, a 2 mana 4/3, sure you gotta crew it, but still, those are not common stats. Those are stats that come with a really, really big drawback, like Wanted Scoundrels or Tetris Pit Dweller. Soulripper doesn't have that big of a drawback. The only drawback is you gotta have another creature to crew it, but that can even be an upside because it's not gonna be a creature to die to a Wrath or whatever. So there's upsides and downsides to being a vehicle rather than strictly being a drawback, like Treacherous Pit Dweller or something. So it starts off with crazy stats, and then when you think about it, a single attack, this is gonna become a 5/4, and it gets menace for the turn, which turns it into a Steel Leaf Champion, a Woolly Thoctor. Like, that's huge, and then it's gonna continue to grow throughout the game. This card is insane. This is such an amazing aggro threat, and it gets even better when you consider it within the context of various formats. Like, think about Standard. What are black decks doing in Standard? They're sacking Eye Twitches and Shambling Gas. Unfortunately, they're a little bit too small to crew a Soulripper by itself, but still, these are great sacrifice fodder to grow your Soulripper to give it menace. You don't mind them dying. Shambling Gas kind of works twice. You can sack it and make a treasure token. Then the next turn, you can sack the treasure token to make Soulripper even bigger and even more menacing. And then we got all these random artifact tokens. That's the other reason I'm super high on this card. Maybe you're playing a blood token deck. You can just sack your blood tokens. Maybe you're playing a prosperous innkeeper deck. You can sack your treasure tokens to grow your Soulripper. So I think this card has staple potential in essentially any sort of aggro deck in standard. There's so many easy synergies. It lines up well with what these aggro decks are trying to do in the format. The card's absurd. It's just so big. It's so powerful. And then once you get back to older formats, I think this has a shot in mono black aggro decks. If you look at mono black aggro decks in like historic or pioneer, or to a lesser extent modern, they're often built around 1 mana, 2 powered creatures that come back from the graveyard. Grave Crawlers and Bloodsoaked Champions and Dreadwanders and Gutterbones. These cards are perfect with Soulripper. They're big enough to crew Soulripper. Plus, you can sacrifice them more or less for free because you can put them back into play. So I think it is an easy inclusion in the 2-drop slot in those formats as well. So Soulripper, this card's very, very high on my list of most powerful cards in the entire set. When we do our top 10 list coming up next week, don't be surprised to see some Soulripper showing up in various formats because this card is just way above the curve, and it fits naturally in so many pre-existing decks. We also got Rasona Astri Commander. So Rasona, kind of an interesting Boros legend, 3 mana 3/3, a legendary human samurai with haste. When it deals combat damage to a player, if it doesn't have an indestructible counter on it, put an indestructible counter on it, but whenever you take combat damage, you have to remove an indestructible counter from Rasona. So essentially, you smash your opponent with this, you get an indestructible counter, it's going to be really hard to kill, but almost like the Monarch, if you take combat damage, you're going to lose that indestructible counter. Actually, that's kind of exactly how this indestructible counter is going to play. It is worth pointing out that you can only ever have 1 indestructible counter, so it's not like you can get in a few attacks and build up a whole bunch of indestructible counters to prepare for when you take combat damage in the future. But still, Rasona's pretty interesting. How good it'll be, I think, remains to be seen. So it wasn't that long ago I would see a 3 mana 3/3, and I would say, these cards are traditionally pretty good in Magic. If you go back 10 years, a 3 mana 3/3 haste was kind of like a legit card, but now it's very much not. We got Sunrise Cavalier, 3/3, trample haste, all these extra upsides, doesn't really see play. We got Hulking Bugbear, 3/3 haste, it doesn't really see play. So just being a 3/3 haste isn't good enough anymore. So if Rasona is going to see play, it's going to be based on that ability. Is that ability good enough? I'm going to lean towards not for it to see main deck play, but this feels like the kind of card that can be a sideboard all-star. It reminds me a little bit of Haktos in that in some matchups it's really bad. In other matchups, it can be almost unbeatable. The power of Rasona is if you play against a control deck, it's going to be great. A control deck, maybe a Teferi who slows the sunset, blue-white deck, or Esper deck, a Hullbreak horror style Izzet deck, Rasona is going to be one of your best cards because control decks don't have creatures to pressure you, to hit you, to remove the indestructible counter. So you just slam this, hit your opponent, make it indestructible. Sure, it can still get bounced, which is annoying, but really, it is going to survive rest. It's going to survive most removal. It's going to be really, really tough for a control deck to beat. So I think that it could be a great sideboard sniper, like we've seen with past indestructible creatures, to bring in against control decks to make your deck a little bit more resilient to removal and wrath. On the other hand, if you're playing against an iTwitch deck, or an Azeka's Chariot deck, or mono green, or mono white, then this isn't very exciting. A 3/3 haste for 3, as we talked about before, just isn't really exciting anymore in 2022 like it was a decade ago. And it's going to be hard to keep the indestructible counter, because sure, you maybe get an attack and make it indestructible, but then your opponent's going to hit you with an iTwitch, or some big green thing, or some white flyer, and you're just going to remove it, so then it's not really doing much of anything. So I think that Rasona, in standard, I expected to see a lot of sideboard play, probably not much main deck play. When you get back to older formats, there are some shenanigans. This is probably mostly commander stuff, but it kind of combos with Nesting Ground. Nesting Ground, for 1 mana, can move a counter from target permanent to another target permanent. So the idea here would be, you play Rasona as your commander, you hit someone, you get the indestructible counter, and then you move that counter to another creature. The other creature does not have Rasona's drawback, where you take combat damage and you lose that counter. So once you move the counter to another creature, it's just indestructible indestructible permanently, and then it also resets Rasona, so the next turn you can attack with Rasona. It doesn't have an indestructible counter because you moved it to something else, and then you get another one, and you can just keep doing this and kind of oddly really slowly make your entire team indestructible. The other way you can kind of do this is the Ozolith. The Ozolith in like a blink effect, like teleportation circle, hit your opponent, get the indestructible counter, blink Rasona to trigger the Ozolith to get its counter, and then at the beginning of combat on the next turn, put it on another creature, and then hit your opponent with Rasona and blink it again. So kind of a multi-step process, but still moving the counter around to other creature is really powerful because you're not going to lose it like Rasona will. So I think Rasona, good sideboard card for standard, kind of a fun Boros build around in Commander if you do the counter manipulation, Ozolith, nesting ground style shenanigans. So a neat card, not sure good enough for main in deck playing standard, but still definitely a cool design. We also got, a new Wrath, a Super Wrath, Farewell. So 6 mana sorcery, choose one or more, exile all artifacts, all creatures, all enchantments, or all graveyards. So you can choose one of those, you can choose all 4 of those. It is a pretty crazy card. So this card, I mean, its most obvious home is going to be in Commander. In Commander, I'm looking for my Wrath to be one of 2 things, essentially. I either want Wrath to be efficient, like Toxic Deluge, or Blasphemous Act, or Vanquish the Horde, so I can Wrath and then cast other things in the same turn, or I want my Wrath to be flexible, like a Steward Command, or Merciless Eviction, where I have some control over, okay, there's problematic artifacts, or enchantments, or maybe I need some of my stuff to live, so I'm not going to choose that option. I think that Farewell definitely hits the mark on the latter, on the flexibility scale, and I think this is just the best at what it does. Like, I think this replaces a Steward Command in Merciless Eviction. This is just a way better version of that effect. I love that they also added in Graveyard Hate, which is really, really huge. I wouldn't say it's like strictly better than a Steward Command, because sometimes you like use a Steward Command to keep your small creatures around or keep your big creatures around, but really, I think this is just mostly better than all of these effects. And as I mentioned before, adding in Graveyard Hate's really sneaky. We always talk about we should play more Graveyard Hate in Commander, because there's a lot of really powerful graveyard shenanigans. Almost every deck at least has recursion, and then there's like dedicated graveyard decks that if you don't have hate for, they're just gonna run over the table. Farewell kind of just sneakily tacks that on. It's a card that you play to wrath away creatures or artifacts or enchantments, but you also just get this graveyard hate in case you do need to clean up the graveyards. So I think this card is just a new staple in Commander. Plus, exiling can be big in certain matchups where you get rid of indestructible creatures, for example, so that's another upside. Gets rid of things forever. We also talked about the recursion aspect of Commander decks, reanimation that most decks have. Exiling things mostly gets rid of them forever, and you're not going to have to deal with, you know, some problematic thing coming back from the graveyard and getting you a second time. So I think in Commander, this probably just goes in all my white decks. I still play a Steward Command quite a bit, and I think this just replaces a Steward Command in pretty much every single deck. Then in Standard, I think we're going to have to wait and see. I don't think this is staple level in Standard. Like, Doomscar is pretty efficient, thanks to Foretell. I don't think you're going to see the control decks just dump their Doomstars for Farewells. On the other hand, we're entering a Standard of Sagas, and also vehicles, and also there's some graveyard synergies, some powerful reanimation entering the format. So if we end up in a world where there's a lot of vehicle decks, or there's a lot of enchantment-based saga-style decks, or there's powerful graveyard decks, then I think this goes way, way up in value, because Doomscar isn't going to get rid of the vehicles, or the sagas, or whatever other artifacts, enchantments are running around. It's not going to sweep away the graveyard. So I think this still could have a role in Standard, even though its primary home is going to be in Commander. We also got a pretty interesting equipment, an Eater of Virtue. So 1 to cast, 1 to equip, gives equip creature +2/+0, and then when the equip creature dies, exile it, and long as the card exiled with Eater of Virtue has an ability. There's a huge list: flying, first strike, double strike, death touch, haste, hexproof, indestructible, lifelink menace, protection, reach, trample, vigilance, blah blah blah, basically any ability. Then or Eater of Virtue is going to grant that ability. So if a flyer dies, all of a sudden Eater of Virtue is going to give flying as well. If a hexproof creature dies, then it's going to give hexproof as well. So as your stuff dies, it's going to get upgraded throughout the game. So this is essentially a Bone Splitter, a very aggressive equipment. It's exactly a Bone Splitter, with the downside of being legendary, but the upside that you also get this crazy Soul Flare keyword soup ability, and I think this card is actually pretty powerful. So Bone Splitter is a kind of card that can see play in aggro decks, just 1 to cast, 1 to equip, +2/+0, throw that on a Eye Twitch or a Battlefield Raptor or 1,000 Face Shadow, some cheap flyer, and you're getting in a lot of damage. And the thing that makes this even more exciting is, let's say that's the plan you go with. You play cheap flyers like Eye Twitch to put Eater Virtue on. Once your Eye Twitch dies, then all of a sudden, Eater Virtue is going to give flying. So that means later in the game, you can stake it on a big creature and give it flying. So I don't think you got to do that much work to make this card good. My only real concern in Standard is the legendary aspect. I'm not sure you can play more than one of these, but in the right deck, it seems like it can be powerful enough to see Standard play. You also get additional synergies. I mean, it's a cheap equipment for Akiri or Sram in older formats. It's a cheap way to modify creatures. Maybe you're playing a modify deck, and we've talked a lot about how I think modifying is mostly going to be about counters, especially +1/+1 counters, but something like Eater of Virtue is cheap enough that it is a nice little bonus way that you can modify something, plus it works well with the aggro theme of what a modified deck would probably be anyway. As far as Commander, a little bit less exciting, +2/+0, kind of whatever, not like the biggest upgrade, so I think this is mostly kind of a keyword soup equipment for Odric or Cathril. If you're playing a deck that's all about, you know, these abilities and shenanigans and moving them around, then Eater of Virtue is a nice addition. Just keep in mind, there is a weird additional drawback here. Legendary is a drawback. The other drawback is you gotta exile your creature when it dies, which can be kind of a bummer. Like, there's times when you're gonna want your creature in the graveyard so you can get it back from the graveyard later, have other synergies. So I feel like that is a bit of a drawback, but still, this card's really cheap. It's efficient. I think it's got a chance in the right deck in Standard, just based on its efficiency alone as a Bone Splitter style card with upside. And then in Commander, if you're messing around with abilities, seems like a nice addition there as well. We also got some set booster exclusives. So these are cards that are sort of in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, but not technically in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Basically, their legality is similar to Commander precon decks, so we can't play these in Standard, or Modern, or Historic, or Pioneer, but they're legal in Commander, and then also in Legacy if that's relevant, but still some really sweet Commander stuff. So first off, oh my goodness, one of the coolest cards Wizards has maybe ever made. Go Shintai of Life's Origin, a new Shrine Commander. 4 mana, 3/4, technically 5 colors, because it has a 5-color ability that lets you return an enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then, whenever it or another non-token shrine enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 colorless shrine enchantment creature token. Again, reminder, Shrine is not a creature type, so this actually has no creature type. Same with the tokens, they're not creature type shrines, it's enchantment type shrines, so like changelings are not going to work with this or whatever. Shrine as a creature type doesn't exist, but this card is super sweet. This is the commander if you want to play all the shrines. We got a bunch of other new ones, we got the original cycle, we got the Sanctum cycle, so if you want to just jam all 15, well 16 I guess, counting Sanctum of All, or 17 would go Shanti of Life's Origin, if you want to jam them all together in a commander deck, this is the leader of that deck. And not only is it a leader of the deck, it is perfect for the deck because the shrine tokens that it makes power up your shrines. The way shrines work is they all want as many shrines on the battlefield as possible, because the more you have, the more powerful each individual shrine is going to be. So Go Shanti is like the perfect commander for a shrine deck, and one of the commanders I'm most excited to build around. Also a sneaky good saga commander because of its reanimation ability. So if you want to play 5-color sagas, this is a great option. You are not going to make a bunch of shrines, but that's fine, although you could play both. Sagas and shrines together would probably be pretty sweet. But this is a way you can get back your Kiora Best Sea God, or Elspeth Conquers Death, or Waking the Troll for even more value. So if you were playing Sisay shrines or Atraxa sagas, I think this is just the way to go now. It's cool, it's powerful, it's on flavor, it's an absolutely awesome card. Wizard just kind of nailed it with this one. We also got a new cycle of Myojin. So Myojin's one of the most famous cycles from original Kamigawa. They are back as set booster exclusives, one of each color. If you're not familiar with these, they're really big creatures that come into play with a counter, and you can remove the counter to do something. So Myojin of Towering Might, for example, 8 mana, 8/8. It's a legendary spirit. It enters the battlefield with an indestructible counter if you cast it from your hand, and then you can remove an indestructible counter from it to distribute 8 +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control, and they can trample until end of turn. The red one, same setup. You can remove the counter, deal 7 damage to up to 3 targets. The black one, actually pretty powerful. You can remove the counter to put all creatures from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control that were put there from anywhere this turn. That one seems really easy to build around. You play it, it's indestructible. You cast a Wrath, blow up all the creatures, and then remove the counter and steal everyone's creatures, essentially. The blue one may be my personal favorite. Remove the counter to copy a permanent spell 3 times. So you're going to get 4 copies of whatever permanent that you play. And then the white one, remove the counter to make a 1/1 token for each permanent you control. So a late game in a game of Commander, it's gonna make a lot of tokens, like 10, 20 tokens pretty easily. So I love to see these cards returning. The original Myojin cycle was just such an amazing, really sweet cycle. However, I do have a criticism here. My one criticism, actually, there's 1.5 criticisms. One criticism is, if you read the original cycle, they all get divinity counters. They work the same way, but they enter with a divinity counter that you can remove. The new ones just enter with an indestructible counter, which actually opens up some non-bows. Like divinity counters, you could use Kindred Boon, or that which was taken, with the original cycle, but not with the new cycle. So if you want to jam all these together, there's some non-bows with the support cards. The other thing that's a little bit awkward is they're not going to be great commanders, which is actually true of the original cycle as well, but they only get the counter if they were cast from your hand. So that means like the new Myojins, similar to the old ones, if you play them from the command zone, they're actually just really, really bad. So these are cards that are pretty much exclusively 99 cards. I'm sure there's weird hoops you can jump through where you play it as a commander and try to get a counter on it in a different way. There's not a ton of ways to put indestructible counters on things, but keep that in mind. This is more something that you would jam in the 99 of a commander deck than build around, because its abilities don't really work from the command zone. So I mentioned the non-bows with Kindred Boon, that which were taken. A little bit disappointing. At the same time, there are some ways to put indestructible counters on things. Trite Sanctum, for example, can turn a Myojin into a god and then put an indestructible counter at. Cathril can move them around. The Ozolith can potentially move them around. So there's still some shenanigans. So how good is this cycle? I think it's more fun than good. I think it's something you can definitely play for fun in the 99 of your commander deck. Some are stronger than others. I think black and blue rank at the top of my list as far as just raw power. And this opens up the possibility of Myojin Tribal, essentially, where you play this cycle and the original cycle all together in the same deck. The deck's probably not going to be super strong, but it does seem like a fun deck to build in Commander. We also got, oh boy, Ruthless Technomancer. 4 mana, 2/4 human wizard. When it enters the battlefield, you can sack another creature you control. If you do, create a number of treasures equal to the sack creature's power. Then you can pay 3 sack X artifacts to return target creature with power X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. X cannot be 0. Ruthless Technomancer. I think this card is pretty interesting. So far, the opinions on this card vary widely. I've seen some people saying that this card is essentially Dockside Extortionist of 2022, like just a broken auto-include for every deck. Other people think it's more of an archetype staple. Personally, I don't think this is Dockside good. I don't think this is a bad card, and I think it can be very powerful playing this, sacking something big to make a ton of tokens. There's some weird combo potential, but I don't think you just jam this in every deck. It's going to take more support. Think of your typical commander game where turn 1 you do nothing, turn 2 you play Mana Rock, turn 3 you play this. It kind of does nothing. On the other hand, Dockside Extortionist on turn 3, turn 4 is often pretty powerful, already being a ritual because everyone else is playing their Mana Rocks as well. So this is much slower, and I don't think it just shows up in any deck. I don't think this is Dockside busted. Also doesn't work as well with the blink shenanigans because you got to keep sacking a creature. When Dockside, if you blink it, it's absurd and just busted. So I think Ruthless Technomancer is sweet, but I do not think it's Dockside Extortion is busted. On the other hand, I think there's a ton of homes for this deck. Any commander deck that cares about treasure synergies, I think this is probably just an auto-include. Kaelin, Prosper, Tomebound, but it really goes beyond that as well. Like, it's a wizard, so it's kind of absurd with Anala double triggering to make tons of treasures. It grows Akiri. It works well with like Dargo, for example, a really big creature that's nice to sack and cares about artifact synergies like Chatterfang, sacking Piru, dedicated sack decks like Corvold. So I think that even though this is not on the power level of something like Dockside Extortionist, there's still a ton of different decks in Commander that are probably going to want a copy of Ruthless Technomancer. So I think this might be one of the chase cards from the set booster exclusives this time around. There's also some combo potential with Dockside Extortionist. In a free sack outlet, you can Dockside Extortionist to make some treasures, and then you can sack the treasures to reanimate the Dockside Extortionist with Ruthless Technomancer, and then you sacrifice Dockside and do it again. As long as you're making enough treasures with Dockside Extortionist, it essentially just gives you infinite mana, infinite death triggers, infinite ETB triggers. Although in this case, I mean, this is probably a testament to Dockside Extortionist being absolutely busted rather than the bustedness of Ruthless Technomancer, but it is worth keeping in mind that combos exist. So Ruthless Technomancer, card's really good. If you want to make some treasures, you want to ramp, you want to do reanimator shenanigans, you're in a sacrifice deck, you're in a wizard deck, I think this is going to be very, very powerful in your commander deck. But for me, it's a little bit far away from auto-include in just any black deck like Dockside Extortionist. We also got Yoshimaru Ever Faithful, and I gotta say I love this card. 1 mana 1/1 legendary dog. Whenever another legendary permanent enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then it has partner. This is a card that I love for flavor purposes. Is this a powerful commander? Obviously, no. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with a small upside. But what this is this is a good boy, a dog that you can partner with any partner. So if you have a favorite partner, now you can, for flavor purposes, have their pet dog come along in Yoshimaru. So I think that from a flavor perspective, this card is a huge win. And I think we'll see people playing it. The people that love a specific partner and also love dogs, throw them together. And now you have, you know, the pet and owner, whatever type of setup. So I think from a flavor perspective, it's really good. From a competitive perspective, it's not a very strong card, but that's not what this is about. It's just a really cool flavor card that a lot of people are really going to appreciate. Finally today, there's a ton of lower rarity cards. We got literally the entire set. Not going to bother to talk about them because there's way too many to talk about, but you can see them all. If you want to head over to mtgpreviews.com, full set it up, sort it, filter it, find what you like the most. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers for today. So now that we've seen the full main set, what do you think? What's your hype level at? 1 to 10, where are you on Kamigawa? What do you build in first in standard or commander or modern, whatever format you love? What are you most hyped for? Let me know in the comments. And don't worry, even though we've reached the end of main set spoilers, there's still a ton of Kamigawa to come. We got commander precon spoilers on Monday. We'll have top 10 lists for various formats. And then, of course, gameplay featuring these cards on the YouTube, on the stream, as soon as the set releases. So tons of Kamigawa to come. Thanks for hanging out this spoiler season, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it. And I'll be back Monday with the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Commander Precon spoilers. So until then, have a great day, have a great weekend, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Kamigawa spoiler coverage? Well, we do a spoiler video every day during spoiler season, and you can find the 2 most recent ones right over here.